And none of that, somehow, led to a fulfilling, comfortable relationship. In fact, dating was painfully awkward. And that is how feminism ruined my love life. Hello, and welcome to the 12 Days of Tradmas. If you're new around here, my name is Kit, and Tradmas is a series I do in December where I talk about the harmful beliefs and ideas promoted by certain influencers, content creators, and so on. Basically, my normal content, but more of it and with a festive flair. And today, per request, we'll be looking at Patience Xina's video, Feminism Destroyed My Love Life. This was sent to me, submission form linked below by the way, with the note, Patience Xina has a video on how feminism has ruined women. Feel free to counter her claim. And so here we are, because why not? I would like to disclaim that I'm not the arbiter of feminism, and like everything else, religion, politics, opinions, everyone's mileage will vary. I also don't know any of these women, so my thoughts and opinions are based on these articles they've written. I also found this video simultaneously vague and scattered, so it's a bit difficult to make a coherent commentary on it, so I hope it makes sense. And finally, I'll add my thoughts here and there and save the majority for the end. And at that, Patience begins her video with the observation that she's been seeing more and more articles of women in their 50s and 60s writing about how feminism or their feminist beliefs have negatively impacted their love lives. Let me know if you've also observed this. I can't say that I have, but I'm also not everywhere, so as to why we're going to be discussing this.
Because I think it could be quite interesting, and I definitely think their stories serve as cautionary tales for women who also want to have families, but maybe are trying really hard to apply a feminist way of doing things, or trying to apply some of the feminist beliefs in the way that they try to conduct their relationships.
Can someone please direct me to where I can find the feminist guidebook to dating and relationships? I joke, but seriously, there is no one feminist way to date or be in a relationship. Even among feminists, we all have different wants and needs, we all have our own way we want to be treated, and we all have the way we treat others. Which brings us to our first article, I Regret Belittling Men. At 63, I've Ended Up Alone by Kate Mulvey. And I gotta say, that title just makes me wonder, does she regret belittling men because it was not a good thing to do? Or does she regret it because she's single? Anyway, I'll link the articles below. But I do have to say, my impression of Mulvey, not great. Curiously, this is what makes me shake my head. Quote, if a date bought me a bouquet of flowers, instead of smiling and putting them in a vase of water, I would bite their head off. Can't you buy me some nice olive oil or balsamic vinegar, I said with an eye roll, to one hapless suitor as he stood wilting faster than the fragrant offering he held in his hand. End quote. But this is what Patience focuses on.
Within her article, she also recalls on past experiences that she had within her relationships and how she now sees why she was wrong to do some of the things that she did. For example, she recalls going on holiday with an ex-boyfriend. They went to Italy together and she started speaking in Italian to the waiter. She states that she was oblivious to how she must have made her boyfriend at the time feel, as he was essentially just watching her having a full-blown conversation with this Italian waiter in the language that he didn't understand. And now looking back on it, she says she realizes that she was actually just showing off, and in the process of doing that, she was making him feel very small.
I don't think it's wrong or showing off to have a conversation with someone in their language if you know it, especially if you're in their country. Now, I can see how it could be taken that way, and Mulvey really doesn't come off well in this article, but I still don't think it's inherently wrong. And honestly, I would love to travel with someone who speaks the language of the country we're traveling in. That would make things so much easier. But moving on, the second article is by, Patience says she's been noticing more and more articles like this, but the next one is from 2021. Mulvey's article was published in March 2025, and the third was published in April 2024. If this is some common new thing, shouldn't they all at least be published this year? Anyway, the second article is How Feminism Fucked Up My Love Life, a selection from Lori Gottlieb's Marry Him 2010. And wasn't Marry Him that book? Yes, The Case for Settling for Mr. Good Enough. I don't like it. Anyway, let's see what Patience has to say.
She says that her main problem is not necessarily feminism as a whole, but the distorted version of feminism that encourages women that they can have it all. The reason being is because she feels like it encourages women that they should be able to have everything in all areas, in relationships, in their careers, etc. It doesn't really allow them to have a realistic expectation in terms of what they are able to have in their lives.
Is that a feminist idea? Or is that capitalism co-opting feminist language? I'm really struggling to see what's appealing about the idea that you can work full-time and also handle the majority of housework and childcare. Why would that be something to strive for? Anyway,
she also discusses what she saw often, which was this mismatch between the public feminist identity versus the private secret longing. As she says, quote, "Every one of my single friends wanted to be married, but none of us would admit how badly we craved it for fear of sounding weak or needy or, God forbid, anti-feminist." And I can completely understand where she's coming from. I mean, nowadays, if you express that you want any of these things, you're likely going to be called a pick-me, which is kind of similar to being called an anti-feminist, because whenever you're called these things, it implies that you don't like women, or you're betraying women because you're trying to appease or to pander to men.
What? Pick-me refers to women who belittle other women to appeal to men, not to women who want to get married. You can be a feminist and get married. And to be anti-feminist doesn't mean doing something that's not feminist. Being an anti-feminist means being against feminism. Example, a woman gets married and takes her husband's surname. That is not a feminist act. That's also not an anti-feminist act. Anti-feminists work against equality. You can take your husband's surname and still believe that other women should be free to keep their own, create a new one, whatever. My goodness.
And this is something that Gottlieb actually acknowledges within her own article, as she says that aspiring for or wanting these more traditional ideals is often very much seen as betraying the feminist cause.
I know there are some married feminists in my audience, so I hope you're all walking in shame, knowing you've betrayed the feminists. I've gone to weddings. Does that mean I've also betrayed the feminism?
I also found a really interesting interview that she did with Mary Claire, where she was talking about the problems with the feminist view of self-sufficiency. And she was talking about how she thinks that this idea of being super self-sufficient and hyper-independent is actually antithetical to a successful relationship, which requires interdependence and vulnerability. And so she very much argues that the feminist views about self-sufficiency are actually are misapplied in the context of romantic life. And for that reason, it doesn't really work. And the reason I found it really interesting is because it actually reminded me of a conversation that I had with a friend of mine. I remember in the earlier stages of her relationship where we were talking on the phone, and she was saying how she found that she had to let go of some of these feminist views that she'd had for many years, because we both went through that feministy phase in our lives, because she was very much a hyper independent girl, like very, very independent, wanted to do everything for herself. And so when she got into a relationship with her boyfriend, now husband, she was very much determined to prove to him that she could independently do things, independently problem solve, and that she didn't need him, but not in a spiteful way, just in a way of trying to show him that she wasn't a burden and she wasn't dead weight, she could hold her own. Because to her, she thought that that would be an attractive trait. She thought that that would be something that he would like, when in reality what actually ended up happening was she ended up just making him feel as though, why was he really in her life? Because if she didn't really need him, then what was the point of them even being together? I think that's just because of the fact that for many women, including her at the time, I don't think we really understand just how much feeling needed is quite an important thing to a lot of men. A lot of men like to feel needed or need to feel needed. It is something that is quite important to them. And it's something that I don't think she understood at the time.
Communication is important. Anyway, confession, I am also a hyper-independent person, but that has nothing to do with feminism and more to do with how I was raised. Asking for help is placing a burden on people, and how dare I do that? Anyway, a couple of things.
She's not criticizing feminism as a whole, and she's also not saying that you should just marry and settle down with anybody, but she is making a point of discussing and challenging some of the feminist ideas that are out there that encourage women to believe that they can have it all without having to compromise on anything.
That's just being an adult.
But I guess it would have been pro-feminist if she just kept quiet and just allowed women to potentially end up in the same situation that she's found herself in?
No, feminism isn't about being quiet, but it is an odd look to blame feminism, a set of beliefs and ideas about the equality of women, for your romantic decisions. Especially when you also acknowledge that there is no feminist dating guide. Anyway, that is it for this article. Next, we move on to Feminism Has Left Middle-Aged Women Like Me Single, Childless, and Depressed by Petronella Wyatt, who calls Margaret Thatcher a feminist de facto. Perhaps someone should tell Wyatt that a woman doing things does not make that woman a feminist. Anyway, Wyatt's article seems to be standard anti-feminist stuff, so let's see what stands out to Patience.
Again, Wyatt is not completely against feminism. She acknowledges the many successes and the necessary things that feminism did in the past, such as allowing women to have financial freedom, as well as also giving them the opportunity to access education and the workforce. However, she feels as though as modern Western cultures have evolved and changed, feminism also needs to evolve and change, because she does feel as though our current culture, in the way that it is now, has actually outgrown the old traditional feminist goals. And so she thinks that it's time for it to have a rethink and for it to adapt.
That's so interesting, because throughout this video, it seems to me that they're looking at second wave feminism with 21st century eyes, and of course they're confused. Thanks to feminism, things have changed since the 1970s. And well, quote, but the world has changed in a way the early feminists would find incomprehensible and grotesque. Indeed, she would view today's flag bearers as hollow and preposterous nothings. I sometimes think the West has outgrown the feminist philosophy entirely and should cast it off. Where, for instance, does it leave women like me when we have reached the age of 54, as I have, and find ourselves both single and childless, hugging the collected works of Proust, or engaging in furtive sojourns to the pub that bring remembrances of things pissed? Is that a typo? 1 in 10 British women in their 50s have never married and live alone, which is neither pleasant nor healthy. End quote. Seriously? If you want to get married, get married. Obviously, to someone who wants to marry you, because this is a 2-yes situation, but feminism is not stopping people from getting married if they want to. There is no plot to ensure middle-aged women, and for the record, I am also a middle-aged woman, are lonely, clasping old books they once took comfort in. If you want companionship, go get it. Caveat being that you do have to be someone people want to spend time with. Although, if someone does want companionship and they try to find it and can't, and their reaction is to blame, let's just say, feminism, instead of looking at themselves and what about them might be unappealing to people, I wonder. I wonder. Anyway.
I saw a documentary called The Birth Gap, and they were talking about how there's a generation of older women in Japan who never had children, and the effects that loneliness actually has on them.
Patience goes on to show a clip from the documentary about how older women with no family were throwing themselves off buildings in Japan due to loneliness. I did try to look this up, but all I found was yubutsut, a mythical practice of senecide in Japan, whereby an infirm or elderly relative was carried to a mountain or some other remote, desolate place and left there to die, which is very different from women leaping to their deaths from the sheer despair of having no family. Of course, this is from the Birth Gap film, which has a whole website devoted to debunking it, so I would take any facts gleaned from it with a large grain of salt. Anyway, let's wrap it up.
I do really think that this is a really interesting as well as an important conversation for the reasons I said at the beginning of this video. I think that if you are someone who wants to have a family, then it is important to consider these things and to also learn from the people who have lived a longer life than you, have tried out these theories and put them into practice, and seeing what their outcomes actually look like, so you can decide for yourself if that's something that you would be okay with.
What theories, though? What do the authors of these articles put into practice? Though they blame feminism for being single, they don't actually discuss any feminist theories that led to them belittling men or deciding not to get married. And for that matter, I kind of didn't get the impression that they made the active decision to not get married, just that it didn't happen and that was somehow feminism's fault.
I also have a lot of respect for these women, because it takes a lot to publicly admit that you were wrong and to publicly discuss your regrets. Most people don't feel comfortable doing that, and I'm sure that they must have known that they were going to receive some backlash, and some of them did receive some backlash for what they wrote in their articles.
True, but they aren't taking responsibility for their behavior, which is probably why they received backlash. They're saying feminism made them do those things, which is not owning up to anything. It's just outsourcing blame.
Yeah, I'm sure they knew that was going to happen, yet they still did it anyway, because to them it was more important to get this message out and to try and communicate this with younger women than to just carry on and, save face and pretend that everything is fine when quite clearly it's not.
How noble.
I think the reason why feminism can create these outcomes for some women is because for many women, what has driven them to feminism is a fear of losing freedom, a fear of being oppressed, controlled, trapped, devalued, whatever it may be. And these fears aren't completely irrational. If you are the physically weaker sex, a defense mechanism to protect yourself is to fear the worst from men, so that you can always be prepared for it, or you can at least try and prevent it. But this way of thinking also requires you to constantly be on guard and constantly be playing defense, which is not very good if you're trying to be in a relationship, because you need to be able to be open to connection, vulnerability, and you need to be able to have trust. And that's the complete opposite of being on guard and defensive.
Personally, I was driven to feminism when I read He's a Stud, She's a Slut by Jessica Valenti, and I didn't read it out of fear. I had no conception of feminism at that time, just a vague notion that it was about hating men. The title just spoke to me as someone who had observed and experienced the different ways sexual activity was spoken of in regards to men and women. It was a really eye-opening book, and feminism didn't teach me to fear men. For that matter, I don't fear men in general. I am, however, cautious, because of experience, not because of feminism. Anyway, Patience exclaims that marriage isn't for every woman, and she can't believe she has to say that, and I disclaim too. It's just part of having a platform, however small. Anyway, now we close with a question.
But anyways, I'm gonna wrap up this video now by asking the question, are there any views or beliefs that you ever had that you've had to let go of because you started to realize that they were actually harming your relationship? And I know today this video has been centered around feminism, but it doesn't have to be based on feminism. You know, it doesn't have to be a feminist belief. It could be any kind of belief. Maybe it could be a religious belief. Maybe it could be a cultural belief. Maybe it could be a political belief or any other type of ideological belief that you found was actually harming your relationship, and you found you had to actually let go of it in order to have a healthier relationship.
Oh yeah, I fully bought into patriarchal BS when I was young without a second thought. The guy had to ask me out, pick me up, pay for whatever we did, not talk about anything too deep, not express any emotion, not do anything weird, which is shorthand for anything not stereotypically masculine. And none of that somehow led to a fulfilling, comfortable relationship. In fact, dating was painfully awkward. And that is how feminism ruined my love life. By letting me see that, yes, men are full, complex human beings, and there's no reason for any of us to be restrained and constricted by what society thinks is acceptable for our respective sexes. I wish the authors of these articles had learned that, but, well, it's never too late. There is a lot more I would like to say about this, but I'm pressed for time and, well, Valentine's Day is just 2 months away. But I do want to conclude with, you can't debunk someone's feelings. If these three feel like feminism led them astray, who am I to tell them they're wrong? And I can't really debunk Patience saying that feminism ruined women because, at least to me, she didn't say that in this video. She also didn't really explain how feminism would lead to women being single and lonely in later years. But anyway, the only thing I can do is point out that feminism isn't incompatible with relationships and kids. And also, feminism isn't an excuse to treat people badly. And if you do, you can't really be surprised if they don't want to be around you. Also, feminism is more than someone's personal decisions and romantic relationships, and I'm for real ending this video now before it becomes another 6 pages. And that's it for this video. Thank you so much for watching. Please like if you enjoyed the video, dislike if you didn't, subscribe if you find yourself enjoying my content generally and aren't yet subscribed, and let me know what you think below. I would like to give extra thanks to my patrons. My socials, sources, and resources are linked below, and Merry Solstice!